welcome to this episode of The Daily. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, a couple of days ago, Barack Obama gave a press conference in which he lashed out at his critics who have been claiming that his failure to actually boldly and honestly and succinctly name radical Islam as the primary motivating problem which underpins violence, like the horrific violence we saw in Orlando last weekend, is a very serious issue. It's a very serious threat to America's national security, and it's a major failing of his leadership. Now, he responded to that by claiming that he knows who he's fighting and they know who they're fighting. They don't need to call them by their correct name because they already know who they're fighting. And if any of his advisors had told him to call radical Islam by name in his speeches, then he'd be doing that. And that basically calling it by name honestly and boldly is not going to end the problem. He then went on to claim that by calling it radical Islam, that was actually like a form of loose talk, and that has the ability to inflame the problem and create all sorts of other issues. And you're not de-radicalizing anything, you're not calming anything down by using that terminology honestly and succinctly and boldly. I completely disagree, and here's why. And I think the flaws in what he's saying here are really, really glaring when you stop for a moment to think about how much of a failure of leadership, how serious this failure is actually becoming. So first of all, I don't think you should need an advisor. If you're at that level of leadership in the world, the President of the United States, you should not need advisors to tell you whether or not you should be talking about a problem when it is that blatantly obvious and everyone else in the population knows that that's what the problem is. That to me suggests someone who doesn't really know how to lead with confidence, or who tries to lead by committee rather than having clear-cut leadership skills to navigate difficult situations like this. And it's not a good sign. Secondly, he claims that that naming it radical Islam won't solve the problem. Well, that's great, but no one said it will. It's a straw man to suggest that that's what his critics are saying. What his critics are actually saying is that by refusing to name it, you're not accurately diagnosing the problem, and you can't solve a problem until you accurately and honestly confront what the actual problem is, name it what it is, and then, and only then, can you begin to find a solution. And that doesn't just involve him and a couple of advisors, that's the entire American people who are involved in this, because this is a threat against their entire nation. So it's a failure of leadership, and it leaves people wondering whether the president either doesn't understand, so they're inept and don't understand what the real threat is, or whether there's some sort of other ideological motivation that is causing them not to show good leadership and not to name this. Either way, these things aren't good. And so people are not saying if you name it, you'll fix it. They're saying you can't begin to fix it until you actually honestly and boldly name it. And by not boldly naming it what it is, you are creating a whole lot of other problems. Now, as for Barack Obama's suggestion that he is helping to calm and not inflame things, and he's avoiding radicalization and other things by actually not calling it radical Islam, this is just an absolutely absurd claim. It is so patently false. Let me tell you why that is. First of all, this is a president who has carried out a long-term drone assassination program for much of his presidency. And that drone assassination program has killed a large number of Muslim civilians. We're talking men, women, and children who are innocent. One campaign, drone campaign that they ran, one campaign alone, 90% of the victims it claimed were not even the intended targets. So 90% of the people killed were not the intended targets. Now, words, very rarely will words alone, like honestly naming and boldly naming radical Islam as the problem, very rarely will that cause radicalization of Muslims. But I tell you what definitely will cause the radicalization of Muslims is when they discover or experience you in their nation killing innocent men, women, and children indiscriminately. That will radicalize a population faster than anything else. And it feeds the narrative of the radical Islamic factions who say that America has come to kill you and they are this great threat. And you just have to read the accounts of children who live in these regions where America carries out these drone attacks. And Obama has just extended this program massively. He's killed more people than any other president using drones. And you read these kids and their accounts, and they talk about how fearful they are now of the skies, of being outside, of going anywhere, because they know there's nowhere you can escape a drone missile attack, right? You can be in it, even if you're in a building, there's no protection for you, and there's absolutely no warning that that drone attack is coming, unlike conventional warfare. You can't run away and escape it, because they fly at such a high altitude, you don't even know they're there, and the only moment you realise that you are being attacked is the moment that missile explodes on top of you. So you can imagine how much fear this creates, and that's exactly what the accounts are saying. And what do you think is going to happen to young men, young women, and others who grow up in an environment where they are perpetually afraid of your nation? You're going to contribute to radicalisation. It's just that simple. Secondly, the claim that by not naming it radical Islam, you're actually helping to avoid inflaming the situation is just crazy. Because everyone knows that there is an Islamic component to these killings. When you have people who attend mosques, they are Middle Eastern, they have Middle Eastern parents, they have Arabic names, and they are shouting Allah Akbar as they carry out their killings, everyone knows what's going on. And everyone clearly can see that the Islamic component is the primary motivating factor here. So by not actually naming it radical Islam, which makes a clear distinction between your average Muslim on the street and a radicalized one, you're actually making that important distinction and saying these people are the radicals, they are the threat. By not naming that, you are leaving every Muslim in the world and in your population vulnerable. Because what happens is everyone starts to assume that this Islamic component isn't just about radical Islam. And that's what people are doing right now in America. They are assuming this. They are assuming that in actual fact, that all of Islam is committed to violence. And it's just given enough time, they will all start acting out violently. And so you are creating this fertile breeding ground for Americans to start looking with suspicion, anger, rage, distrust against their fellow Muslim citizen neighbours. Because if you don't call it radical Islam and you don't segregate it away from the mainstream Islam, then what happens is everyone starts to assume that this is just a general Islamic problem. And you see how badly that ends up playing out when you've got a whole nation where a majority of people start to believe that the Muslims who live in their country are actually enemies living in their country, right? Instead of people who are not radicalized like radical Islamic fundamentalism is all about. So this is a massive failure of leadership. Not only that, but not only has Barack Obama not named it honestly and boldly what it is, which means you can't deal with the problem, but he has also tried to name it a whole lot of other things. Like most recently, he was referring to this as a gun control problem. Everyone knows, apart from a small cadre of diehard committed supporters of his, everyone knows that that's not the real problem here. These are periphery issues that he is trying to call the main problem, while the main problem remains undiagnosed, and while he is contributing to radicalization in Islamic nations by his foreign policy. I've talked about drones. I haven't even touched on his conduct in Syria. I haven't even talked about the fact that the American army was told to ignore serious sexual abuse in Afghanistan, right? And to stand down and do nothing about that because they were trying to appease local leadership. All of these things have contributed to radicalization. And I can tell you right now, as I said before, using words to accurately diagnose and boldly diagnose what the problem is does not radicalize anyone. It just doesn't. But I tell you what, you certainly cannot begin to diagnose a problem as a nation and move forward and address it with any sort of clarity and civility and stability if you aren't actually willing to seriously and honestly and boldly own what the actual problem is, which is radical Islam. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily.